Good evening all. Welcome to Church on the Way this evening. It's great to be here, isn't it? A lovely, spring evening. The sun's out for a nice stroll along. And tonight we are going to start in a new book. We're going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 1. So, do feel free to make your way there, just after Ruth. But before we get into it, I'm going to just stop and pray for God's word as we open it before we have a short introduction. So, Heavenly Father, I thank you for the opportunity to meet tonight. Thank you for, just the power of your word. Thank you that we can turn to it this evening and open a book that is thousands of years old. And I thank you that because your word is eternal, it will speak to us, it will challenge us, it will change us. So we invite you this evening, or whenever we're watching online, I pray that as we open your word in 1 Samuel, I pray that by your Spirit you would be our teacher. I pray that you'd challenge us. I pray that you'd help us to see and understand something of these lives of these people that lived thousands of years ago. But I pray that they would be helpful, relevant, and formative for us today as we live in 2021. So please be our teacher now as we open your word. In your name, amen. Brilliant. Well, Pastor Dave was saying on Sunday morning, I believe it was, how the Bible has been attacked, has been critiqued, probably burnt more than any other book in the whole of history. And we're going to see again tonight the power of this wonderful book. This passage that we're going to study here, in the first book of Samuel, was written somewhere between 1100 and 1050 BC. Okay, so we're talking a good 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago that this book was written and the stories were recounted. And I think it's fair to say that none of us this week have read a 3,000-year-old book and have taken it in, other than the Bible, of course. I don't think there's many teachings, if any at all, besides the Bible, that have survived that test of time. And as we open it tonight, we're going to see again of the power of it and the fact that it is eternal, as I prayed at the start. Now, before we get into tonight's chapter, in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel, I just want to take a quick step back and a look at the context at where we're picking this up. Of course, we've just finished in Revelation, right at the end of the Bible, so it's a bit of a skip back. 1,000 and a bit years maybe, but we're skipping back. So I just wanted to make sure we understand where we're at in the Bible here and what's going on at this time. Well, Haley, the Bible commentator said helpfully, Samuel was the connecting link between Judges and the kingdom. Okay, so off the back of Judges and before the kings start to reign, that's exactly where we are right now in the Bible in this period of history. So, at the end of the reign of the Judges, we read in the very last verse of Judges, feel free to turn there if you're a slight hand with the old Bible. In Judges 21:25, we read, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And this is the kind of period that we're talking about here. And as I figured out this is where we were, I thought, well, how bad was it in Judges? What was going on? And if you've studied it, it's pretty bleak in places. Chapter 4 to 5, I think we've got, is it after Watershed? Hopefully it is, because we've got a tent peg which is getting hammered through somebody's head. I guess everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Must have funny eyes. In 10 to 12, we've got a guy that I won't try and pronounce his name, Jephthah, who's described as a hilltop thug, who's so unfamiliar with the God of Israel, he thinks that sacrificing his daughter will please God. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And you can see this is some pretty, dare I say it, messed up stuff that was going on. And there was rape, there was sacrifice of children. It just wasn't really wasn't good. And I think that ending line, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, it makes some of the stuff that was going on, it makes today look quite civilized, although there is a little bit of that flavor of everyone does what's right in their own eyes in today's society, admittedly. Now, this book of Samuel is named after, of course, Samuel, he's going to anoint the first two kings of Israel, who hopefully we all know, Saul, and then, of course, David follows on. And Samuel's one of the last of the judges, basically, and we'll enter into a period where the kings would rule. Now, Samuel is also credited with being the author of parts of this book, along with Nathan and Gad, I believe. So it's Samuel that is kind of recounting some of this. Certainly in the early passages here, it's going to be Samuel that's speaking. And we're going to transition into the kings shortly, but to start with, we're still kind of in the end of the rule of the judges, as it were. There's going to be three men that we're going to look at by and large throughout this book. First, it's going to be Samuel. Second is going to be Saul, King Saul. And then finally, King David. So that's who we're going to be looking at. But tonight, we're not going to look at any of the three of those too much, because what we meet tonight is we meet a wonderful lady called Hannah, who's Samuel's mother. And I'm sure many of us will have looked at this passage before, but there's a lot that we can learn from Hannah, and I pray that we will learn from Hannah as we study this passage tonight. As we go through the book of Samuel, we'll recognize stories from Sunday school, and hopefully we'll kind of be built up and encouraged, challenged in our faith with this book, as I say, that is 3,000 years old. So 1 Samuel 1, that's enough of an introduction from me. 1 Samuel 1, let's read that together now, if that's all right. Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, the Ephraimite. Apologies if the pronunciation's incorrect in any of those. And he had two wives. The name of one was Hannah. The name of the other was Peninnah, that's how you say it. When I was studying, I thought, how do I say that? How do I get it in? And I thought, whenever I go to see Vicky in the coffee shop, she gives me a panini. So I swap it for panini to Peninnah. So Peninnah was the name of the second wife. Peninnah had children, and Hannah had no children. This man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. So they're Eli's two sons. Eli's the high priest. His two sons were there also. We'll see these guys later on in 1 Samuel. And whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival also provoked her severely, to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it was year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, that she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. So Hannah's not eating because she's being ridiculed and provoked by Peninnah, the other wife. Now, the first thing to note in this passage is this man called Elkanah. Now, there are two other Elkanahs in the Bible, but this is the only time that we meet this chap. So basically, if we're looking for some hidden significance of this man being the great-grandson of so-and-so and lives in such and such a place where he's actually secretly got status, to be honest, he kind of was a bit of a nobody. He wasn't from a posh line. He wasn't, really of much significance. But we're going to learn a bit about him tonight and how often that happens, isn't it, where God uses a man or a woman that maybe isn't somebody that we would expect to be used. Maybe they're not famous, maybe they've not got status or wealth, but maybe it's just a plain old Joe. And how encouraging that is for us, isn't it? Certainly is for me, because I am one of those men really that he can use all of us, despite wherever we're from. And this man's from Ramathaim Zophim in the mountains of Ephraim, I think maybe 5 miles or so north of Israel. Now, he's got 2 wives. We're going to come on to that shortly, okay? I think probably all know that's not good. But he really was quite an ordinary man. Now, the issue of having 2 wives, whenever we see it in the Bible, it causes problems, basically. And the reason it causes problems is because it's not how God designed it. In Deuteronomy 17, verse 17, he must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. And it also goes on there to warn about accumulating large amounts of silver and gold. But basically, it was never how God designed it. Whenever it happens, it causes problem. But it was, however, socially accepted back then. Okay, so it's not God's plan, but it was socially accepted. There's a lot of things in today's society which are not God's plan, but are socially accepted. And this is a similar thing, really. It's not how God designed it. And when you do it in a way that God doesn't design it, you get a lot of problems. And that's the same with the things that we see today. We believe here that sex outside of marriage is not God's plan. And whenever you get that, you get a lot of problems. Here, 2 wives, you're going to get problems, and we're going to see this now. And we see some bad stuff start to get introduced. You see like this provocation that's going on, which is causing Hannah great pain because Peninnah is, jibing at her or, causing a lot of problems. And even the way Peninnah is described as Hannah's rival. And it's like, oh, wow, like rival. That's how it would have been if there were more than one wife. There would have been rivals for their husband's attention. Just plain old not right, basically. There would have been jealousy and competition, just as we saw with Jacob, didn't we? We saw exactly the same thing. Rivalry, just not really not good. Now, it was accepted in the Middle East, kind of in those ancient times. A common practice, according to the Study Bible, a common practice among ancient Israelites as well. And what would happen is failure to have children was regarded as a family tragedy for several reasons. Basically, children were needed to help with the work of everyday life. And without sons, the family's name would not be preserved. And without an heir, the family would be unable to maintain its kind of, tribal allotments, it says here. So, if the gentleman didn't have children, he would get another wife, basically. That's how it worked in order to have those sons to preserve the family name. Now, we'll see this mistake repeated again, won't we, in the Kings? I think, they have kind of more than one wife, and we'll see similar problems going on. Now, Elkanah was, when he went to give the sacrifices, there would be kind of feasts and partying at the time, and what would happen is he would give to Hannah double. And if ever there's a thing that, I don't know, he probably meant well, didn't he? But in giving double, you can imagine the sort of jealousy and upset and concern that would bring. For Peninnah sat there going, well, hang on a minute, she's got double what I've got. For Hannah sat there going, well, I've not got children. She just wanted children, as we're gonna find out here. But the jealousy that it caused meant that there was like a lot of like provoking, and it made Hannah miserable. It's pretty horrible stuff, to be honest, what was going on, and you can imagine the pain that Hannah would sort of go through because of this. Verse 7, so it was year by year. So it's not just a one-off thing when she went up to the house of the Lord that she provoked her. So Peninnah's provoking her year on year. It wasn't like a fleeting thing. This was a yearly provocation and taunting, bullying. I don't know what we want to say, but you can imagine if we put ourselves for a minute in Hannah's shoes, her thinking, maybe next year's the year where I'll have a child. Maybe it's next year. Maybe it's next year, but all the time next year comes, more provocation comes, and Hannah's not got a child. So if we put ourselves in her shoes, we can see why that would be a very, very painful thing, and why we read here, therefore she wept and did not eat. She's gone off her food. She's really, sounds like she's pretty much rock bottom, and we're gonna see, but maybe next year she would have thought. And this taunting probably would have just taken her down each year, a little bit less confident, self-worth, confidence maybe just eroding away. And if you've ever met somebody in that place when the twinkle leaves their eye and they just maybe look a bit of a shell of the former self, I imagine that this is where we're picking up Hannah here, kind of really vulnerable, really, really low. As we look at the characters throughout 1 Samuel, I think it's always easy for a start. I'm going to say this. It's always easy for us to put ourselves in the position of either the hero or the one that does the right thing. And I think whenever we look at it, be it looking at Saul, looking at Peninnah, or looking at Elkanah, I think it's important that we search within, because whilst we perhaps wouldn't be, I hope we wouldn't be as cruel to say the things and the jibes that Peninnah has said to Hannah, I think that what it does highlight to us is how harsh words and provocation, be it around this issue, which is a very sensitive one, or any issue, there's a real danger there that we could be a Peninnah to people in our household, or to people at work, or at church. So I think let's just, as we start out and as we study, and especially when Saul gets, quite horrible, and David's there, it can be really easy, and I've done it before a lot, where I think, I could be like David here, and actually, am I actually more like Saul at this moment in time? I think it's just important that we understand these are real lives, real people, and I'm sure that there's points where we've sort of had the characteristics of all of them, but let's just make sure that we consider Peninnah here, and are we ever that person that makes those cutting remarks? Because as believers, there's plenty of warnings throughout the Bible that we should not be that sort of person. In verse 8, then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Interesting series of questions for a man to ask his wife. If you have a wife, I'd maybe be tempted to have a bit more diplomacy, a little bit more sensitivity there, because these questions, I feel like, what's going on? What's up? If he was aware, he probably would have seen some of the taunting. He probably would have spoken to her and known why she was so upset. They probably had those conversations on walks around how she just longed for one thing. She longed to have a son. But nevertheless, despite maybe, a slightly sort of harsh or insensitive set of questions, I think what we do see here is something of the genuineness of Hannah. She doesn't take his head off, basically, which you could forgive her for doing with these sorts of questions. Hannah, we don't see any kind of anger, retort, malice in this wonderful lady as she goes through this. Now, she probably at this time, as we said earlier, she probably felt quite trapped, hungry, maybe Her husband could have been a little bit more sensitive, we could say. But what we're going to look at now in verse 9 is, I'd argue, almost a textbook, as close to textbook, biblical textbook example of what to do with brokenness. Because this woman doesn't take a swipe at Peninnah, doesn't get angry at Elkanah being insensitive. We read in verse 9, "So Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on my affliction, on your maidservant, and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. No razor shall come upon his head." So quickly, just context. When they go up to make the offerings, it wouldn't have just been like a go and leave your offering. There would have been kind of, banquets, lavish banquets, meat and wine, all sorts going on at this time of year. And that's what, so we've seen Hannah leaving this and going to the temple to basically meet with God. And what we see here is Hannah. It says she was in bitterness of soul, and she's praying to the Lord, and she's weeping in anguish. She wasn't, in England, if we're upset, we might run off to a corner or run off to a dark place or get away from people because we want to save face, or we want to, we're the worst at it, aren't we, guys? We want to stiff up a lip, we don't cry, we don't, This is... Hannah is raw here, and she's before God. She is weeping before God. And I think that she sets us a good example here of not boxing off emotions, which I'm the worst, absolutely the worst at, and acknowledging that actually God's made us who we are, and we are made emotional beings. We see Hannah here completely broken. She's lamenting, bitterness of soul, weeping in anguish. This wouldn't have been like a run in, cry, weep, run out thing. I think that what we're looking at here in verse 9 and 10 is probably more of a transcript of what happened over maybe a period of time. I don't know how long she was there for, but I imagine it wouldn't just be like an instant thing. Maybe we're seeing a part of it, and maybe that's where there's going to be some confusion, but I imagine she was just before God, completely broken. For year after year, she'd longed for this thing, to have a son. Her rival, as it describes, was pretty awful year after year. But what Hannah did was that she took it all to God. And I think that that's the example for us. When we are broken, to take it all to God and not to take it out on whoever has upset us, or, Hannah is here taking it all to God. She is laid bare before God, and she is seeking just a touch from him, just some healing, some reprieve from this lament that she is feeling because of the circumstances that she finds herself in. When she's been provoked for years and years and years, I think we could probably forgive her like a swipe at somebody. No. We can lose our temper when somebody pulls in front of us. This is years of anguish, years of pain. And what an example she's giving us here, that she is before God, absolutely just weeping and seeking him. What a wonderful example Hannah has set for us here when we're in that place of brokenness, to get before God. And that's where, often we can feel the closest to him, I think. When I've been so broken, that's when I feel his touch, know his presence. Verse 11, she made a vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. She's made a vow here, and she's promised basically to give, if God gave her a son, to give this son back to him for service, for the rest of his life. Apparently Levites would usually have served from maybe 25 to 50, but Hannah's gone way above that, and she's dedicated, if there was to be a son, a lifelong service to God. So, and we'll come on to what that will look like towards the end. But here, we'll read on in 12. And it happened as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, and only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought that she was drunk. Eli said to her, how long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you. Poor Hannah. She's surrounded by insensitive men. Alistair Begg says of this verse, he says, this is an embarrassing absence of spiritual insight. I quite like that summary, and it is a little bit, isn't it? Hannah is, it's probably a real sort of slightly put your foot in your mouth moment, which, to be fair to Eli, I could rival him with that. I think I've put my foot in my mouth far more times than Eli ever had. You could write a book longer than 1 Samuel with all the times I've done that. So, I'm not looking on and critiquing him because I'm just as bad. But here, poor Hannah is so distraught. She's so broken that Eli mistakenly thinks that she's drunk. He probably looked at her and thought, this woman's hysterical. She's just had too much to drink. You can't bring that in here. And I think it's maybe an easy mistake to make, and no doubt we've done much, much worse. But I think we've got to be careful as well not to say that insensitive thing. I often think sometimes when I'm talking at work, I think, just like, shut up, Jake. Proverbs says, doesn't it? Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. I could get that one as a tattoo just to remind myself. I think that sensitivity, we do just need to maybe think a little bit more. Same for Elkanah earlier. But Hannah immediately answers. And again, we see something of her character. She is hysterical. She is broken. You could have forgiven her, like a pipe down. I'm really upset here. Will you just give me a break? No. Hannah says, no, my Lord. I guess he is a high priest, so she has a lot of respect for him. No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now. She is a patient and a gracious lady, admittedly a very broken lady as well right here. But again, rather than the harsh word, she explains, look, Eli, high priest, I'm just broken before God, and I'm pouring out my heart because of all of the brokenness that is within there. She probably explained that it's all out of the grief and the sorrow that's been built up over many years of all these tauntings and the longing for this child. And this would of course been a grief that Hannah might have read in scriptures before. There were other stories, other women that had been in a similar place. Of course, Abraham with Sarah, giving birth to Isaac, Jacob and Rachel with Joseph, and there's been many since as well. And there are even kind of these situations today. And I think it's probably even fair to say, perhaps, that there probably will be people in this room that have been impacted with the same sort of pain, or if not you, a family member. And, if that is you or somebody else, I do pray that they would receive something of the touch and the peace of God, because what we're going to see here is amazing. And this pain, as I say, is still experienced today. And I don't want to rush past the pain or go back or rush on to the happily ever after story. Okay, Hannah is going to have quite a few children in the end, to be honest. Spoiler alert, she'll go on and have 6. But right now, I don't want to rush past where Hannah is at this place. It wasn't an accident on behalf of God that Hannah was here. God didn't forget to set his alarm clock one morning and wake up late and think, oh no, sorry Hannah, I slept in. I could have spared you a little bit of anguish there. That's not how God works. This was actually part of the plan, the bigger plan and purpose that God had for Hannah and ultimately for Samuel, who was going to be the son that will be born. The writer of this part of the book. And I don't want us to just fly through that pain and get to the happily ever after, because I think that the lamenting and the pain is actually a very, very, very important part of this journey. And there's a poem that's often attributed to Corrie ten Boom. I don't think she wrote it, but she certainly quotes it in a lot of her writings. Now, this poem is called the Tapestry Poem. Some of you might have heard it, but I'm just going to read it because I think it really speaks to this position that Hannah's in, and it will speak to positions that we will find ourselves in at various points in our lives. But the Tapestry Poem reads like this. It says, "My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I cannot choose the colours. He weaveth steadily. Oftentimes he weaveth sorrow, and I, in foolish pride, forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent, and the shuttles cease to fly, will God unroll the canvas and reveal the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern that he has planned. No, he knows, he loves, he cares. Nothing this truth can dim. He gives the very best to those who leave the choice to him." And as I read that, I thought, do you know what? Of the pain that we will experience, and we will all experience pain in our lives. I think that poem for me, of course, it is biblical as well. I know that the poem is not biblical, but it's based upon biblical truths. We all know Romans 8:38. But I think sometimes the mistake that we can make with scriptures like that is we use them as a happily ever after, 3 weeks later it'll all be hunky-dory. And actually, that's not always how it works. Sometimes, even if we look at people like Stephen was stoned. A wonderful example. Stephen's stoning was watched on by, of course, we know the young Saul, who, was responsible for so much. But for Stephen, Romans 8:38 didn't mean that he was going to get rescued and he'd live happily ever after in a comfortable mansion. Not that Stephen would have done this anyway, but it wasn't like an immediate, it was a long term. And the pain that we go through in life, I feel like this poem just helps us to get that perspective on it a little bit more, because we're not going to understand it all. We're not. I don't think we're called to. I think that we'll probably understand it when we get to glory. And as the poem says, God turns over this tapestry, and we see, that was what you were doing. That point when I was at rock bottom. And here we've got a little bit of a little bit of a privilege where we can actually look back at Hannah's life and we can see some of the tapestry because we're 3,000 years on, and we can see some of that led to that, and then that led to that, and then, oh, wow, Samuel was used, and then this happened, and then... But, I didn't want us just to go on to the birth of Samuel without taking a moment for that pain that Hannah felt and acknowledging that is real, it is raw. Hannah was a real lady that had it very, very hard. We won't understand the painful moments in our life, but I do pray that we would get a glimpse that one day in glory we will see how God was doing something way, way more beautiful than we could ever imagine. And one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 34, you probably know. But that says in there, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And I just think for when we're at that rock bottom place, and this is where Hannah is here, she is rock bottom. And do you know what that promise in Psalm 34, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit, that's for Hannah. Admittedly, it's probably written after, I would imagine, maybe. But it's the same God, and he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Verse 17, we'll keep pushing on. Then Eli answered and said, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Okay, so Eli's quickly realized, oh, whoops, that was the wrong thing to say. She's not drunk. She's really upset. Back out of this. And, he prayed that God would meet, that God would answer that prayer and that weeping that Hannah had kind of had there in that room that day. And Hannah says, yes, I hope so. Please let your maidservant find favor in your sight. Yeah, please, God, will you answer my prayers? Now, here, what we've seen, just take note, Hannah's, by the way, at this stage, not pregnant, okay? She's gone to the temple, she's left, she's not pregnant. But something's happened here, because at the end of verse 18, so the woman went her way and ate, so she started eating again. Her face was no longer sad. And I think what we're seeing here, I believe, is, well, it's a few things. I think God's peace has come into this young woman. And I think God's peace has brought rest where there was previously anguish. But alongside of that, I think it's fair to say that I think that Hannah had faith that God was going to answer that prayer. From a brokenness and from that interaction with Eli, I think that she had a faith that God was going to show up. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from Hannah there, isn't there? Around when we're in that place of pain, what are we doing with that? Are we getting before God? Are we seeking God's peace in that? And I know it's not easy, but we've got a good example here of actually the fact that it's okay to be completely broken and in pieces before God. And I think Hannah's absence of tears and sorrow now is actually an indication of a faith in God. She's gained her appetite. Her face is no longer sad. You can just picture, she started to cheer up. She's a bit more chipper, which is, you could say nothing's changed, but you could also say everything's changed. She longed for, this child, this son. She was getting ridiculed. There's nothing to say that, well, she didn't have the son yet. There's nothing to say that the ridicule didn't continue, but everything's changed because Hannah's whole outlook has changed. And yeah, I honestly believe as I looked at it that God's peace has just touched her. And I believe that in circumstances, it doesn't have to necessarily be the circumstance that changed, but perhaps if God's peace can come in, then everything changes with that, even though the circumstances are the same potentially. But how do we seek out God's peace in trial? That's the question for us. Verse 19, then they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and returned and came to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew his wife, and the Lord remembered her. They're both worshipped. They've returned home. And at this point, Elkanah knew his wife. Hopefully we know what that means. It's physical intimacy between the two of them. Now, by the way, this wouldn't have been a new thing. They've probably had physical intimacy for a long time, and Hannah probably hoped for a long time. They've been married many years, because we know that they've been going year after year and getting the taunting. So who knows? We don't know how long they've been married, but of course, another wife afterwards. It could have been 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years. We don't know. But the difference here is that God began to intervene. The Lord remembered her. That's what it says there. The Lord remembered her. God's starting to intervene, and the difference here is God's touch, is God's blessing. You know, I reckon, church, that prayer that Hannah prayed, I reckon it wasn't eloquent. I reckon it didn't sound well put together. I reckon she completely lost control. I think she was completely broken. And I think that we should be encouraged by that, because it means that out of the pain and the difficulty, God hears the cry. And God's remembered. He's remembered that cry. He's remembered that prayer here. And I think it's beautiful, to be honest. You know, and we see in verse 20, and it came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked for him from the Lord. After all this time, after this pain, after the anguish, a son is born, and his name's Samuel. And you can just imagine the joy, the relief, you know, that she has just been brought below rock bottom, and then God's remembered her. You know, she'd be dancing, you know, maybe a few days after. But, you know, she must just be over the moon. But notice that, again, when the blessing comes of a son, what does she do first? She acknowledges that the blessing comes from God. And that's another example for us. Often, I'm terrible at this. The blessing comes and I go, yay, this is nice. I love the blessing. And I forget to give thanks and stop and give thanks to the one that gave me that blessing. And Hannah's a fantastic example for us here. She immediately acknowledged Samuel as a gift coming from God, because I have asked for him from the Lord. Give thanks. And Samuel's name means name of God, or God has heard. She's looking to God and she's saying, thank you, God, for Samuel. And she dedicated him to the Lord from the very beginning. Before he was even here, she said to God, if you give me a son, I'll give him back to you. He will be yours. And we're going to come on to that. And we see now the man Elkanah and all of his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, not until the child is weaned. Then I will take him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever. So she's going to stick to a promise. So Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only let the Lord establish his word. And when the woman stayed and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And then the woman stayed and nursed him until she had weaned him. Now, the journey of the sacrifice is going again. And there's probably a conversation, you would think, between Elkanah and Hannah. It's like, well, we said we were going to give him to the Lord. And Hannah was like, well, yes, and we will, but not yet. And I think we get a glimpse of probably Elkanah's love for Hannah here, just to go, okay then, let's not force it. If you think that that's right, then when he's weaned, we'll take him. And we'll come on to what she meant by it, because she actually meant to leave him with Eli, the high priest, and to leave him for a life of service. So I think you could probably forgive her a couple of years. When he's weaned, maybe 2, 3, that's when she would have taken him. So you can forgive her those 2, 3 years to love this son that she was so long in the waiting for. And you know what? I also think that perhaps some of those 2, 3 years were some of the foundations in Samuel's life that would prepare him for the life of ministry. Knowing how precious, knowing how cherished this young man was, perhaps that really prepared him for it. And Elkanah is observing the promise, but not forcing it, but probably reaffirming it as well. That I imagine a conversation that goes, okay, not yet, but we will. I think that's probably maybe how it went. Verse 24. Now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, with 3 bulls, 1 ephah of flour, skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. They slaughtered a bull and brought the child to Eli. They've brought gifts of thanks to God, and we get the impression, don't we, throughout this passage that Elkanah is always going and giving thanks to God, which is a great example for us. And here, this is the time where Hannah has brought probably the most precious gift that she could bring to God, I think. I don't think she could have brought anything. She had brought the whole field of bulls, or all of the sheep, or all of the wine, or all of the flour. It wouldn't be a touch on what she brought to God this day. You know, the beauty that will come from this gift to God, from her leaving Samuel to him, we're going to see that as we study right the way through this book. But I think that we should not sort of move on too quickly without understanding this gift that Hannah has brought to God of her son Samuel, who would be left with Eli from this point on. She still loved him, she still visited him, but she would leave him with Eli. Can you imagine leaving your son? I mean, in lockdown, I think probably a few people could, but in a normal world, no, you couldn't. You couldn't imagine longing for a child for so long and then leaving your child with the high priest. But we see what's to become. We see how this young man is going to step in. He's going to be a prophet. He's going to be a really important part of Israel's future and history. Hannah would always love him. We see in the next chapter, next week, I think, Cliff, that Hannah's going to visit him and bring robes regularly. And in verse 26, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me the petition which I asked of him." Hannah's probably not seen Eli since that first interaction where he thought that she was drunk. I wonder if Eli remembered. I wonder if he thought, oh no, I remember that. That was a bad day. I misread that situation. But this is probably the first time back, because of course she's been weaning Samuel, and she got pregnant not long after. Again, Hannah made no mention of the error of judgment, but she's just filled with gratitude and says, God, this is the son that God gave me. You remember that interaction? Well, this is what God's done. Isn't God good? And maybe Eli thought, this woman's completely changed from the day I saw her, and she was in pieces, not eating, sorrowful. Maybe he looked and thought, wow, God, look at the transformation here. And of course, she's come to offer Samuel up for a life of service to God. Therefore, I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he should be lent to the Lord. So they worshipped the Lord there. And they're offering up the thanks. They're offering up Samuel for a life of service. And they're worshipping God for his goodness. How often we cling on to those blessings that God gives us. We're tight-fisted. We forget to thank him for them. And Hannah is a fantastic example for us this evening. This probably was the most precious offering that Hannah could have given. And my study Bible, as we close, the question posed at the end of this chapter in my study Bible was, what are we offering up to God? Are we offering tokens? Do we offer our Sunday mornings, our Wednesday nights, or another night of the week for a Bible study? Is it our comfortable tithe? Is it our 10%? Is that what we're offering? Or are we offering him our entire lives? And I think that there's some really good questions for us from that study Bible there. Out of this sadness and grief, we're going to see God raise up a young man who would be the answer to a lot of the nation's challenges, would go on to anoint future kings of Israel. We'll never know, but I wonder if the love from Hannah in those early years perhaps set Samuel up for this life of service to God, because he understood how precious, how longed for he was, and how planned it was, and God anointed it was that he would be born. If only we understood for us the same, that we too are here. God anointed our birth, and he knows when we will go to be with him. There's a real purpose for Samuel, that he would have understood. He was a miracle baby. He was probably told this. He was born because his mother had a breakthrough, because God heard. You know, that moment where God's peace was brought in. So there's a lot for us to take away from this passage. There's a lot for us, I think, to learn from Hannah. She's an inspiration in how she handled herself, how she conducted herself, and how amazing that out of the darkness of this poor lady's time, in a situation that was over 3,000 years ago, in a very small family at this stage. Of course, it grows, but at this stage, it's a very small family. We see so much that helps us, speaks to us, and is relevant to us today. What a picture of God's grace then and God's grace for us today. So let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you for your word to us this evening. Forgive us when we get stuck in pain, anguish, grief. We make the problem far bigger than we make you. I thank you so much for this chapter. I thank you for Hannah and the example that she is to us. And I pray next time we're broken, I pray that we would remember Hannah. I pray that we would get before you in our brokenness. I pray that we would lament, we would weep before you. Lord, I pray that you'd help us to respond less to others, to retaliate less, to seek you more, to seek your peace more when the challenges and when the storms come. Help us to look to you, to turn our face to you, to fight through the problems, to find you, and to fight through the pain, to find you as this wonderful woman did. And when the circumstances change and as the blessings come, I pray that we would also give thanks, give back to you, acknowledge you and worship you as Hannah did so often. So I thank you for this passage. As we've read and studied, remind us, help it fall on good ground, and I pray that you continue to change us because of the words that we've read in your word this evening, Lord. Change as we ask. In your name, Lord Jesus. Amen.